Welcome back to Renewable Rides. Today's highlight episode comes from our conversation with Nat Bullard, one of the most thoughtful voices in the energy transition, and someone who has a unique ability to zoom out and make sense of where we are in the cycle. In this episode, Nat lays out just how unusual this moment really is. We're seeing demand growth rates that look like the early days of modern power systems, but with a completely new twist: massive, concentrated loads showing up all at once. In some cases, entire service territories are facing gigawatts of new demand from a single customer or cluster of projects. But what makes this moment even more complex is that not all demand is created equal. Data centers care about availability above all else. Whether power costs 2 or 10 cents is secondary. Meanwhile, industrial operators live and die by the cost of electricity, and now both are competing for position in the same queues. Nat also explores what happens when those pressures collide with an already constrained system: interconnection bottlenecks, policy uncertainty, and supply chain challenges, and why that tension is likely to unlock a wave of experimentation across business models, technologies, and behind-the-meter solutions. And importantly, he reminds us that we've seen this kind of volatility before, and that the most resilient players in the market, particularly renewable developers, are built for exactly this kind of environment. If you want to understand the forces reshaping demand, pricing, and innovation in the power sector, and why this moment will redefine what's possible, this is a conversation you won't want to miss. Let's jump in with Nat.
And we're back at growth rates, projected growth rates for load in general, that are back where they were in the mid-90s. So really the beginning of the career for many late career professionals right now. But we're also at a period of unique concentration, which is you have service territories that might have a gigawatt of peak load that have multiple 1 gigawatt plus interconnection requests for demand that they're trying to figure out what to do with. So we're in a unique moment, I think, in this case. And I don't know what era you would have to hearken back to find experience with demand growth of that particular kind. I mean, perhaps the 1920s or the 1930s, right? And so this is a sort of cognitive challenge for everyone. There's also an issue that we have loads of sort of incipient or potential capacity on the renewable side that's bottled up in interconnection queues. That might be able to move faster, but not necessarily. You have one cohort of large load customers, the hyperscalers and data center operators that are, relatively speaking, extremely underexposed to the actual cost of electricity, but highly geared to its availability.
Yeah.
So does it cost 8 cents or 10 cents is much less important than is it there or not. But you have other industrial and commercial customers for whom the cost is absolutely material. If you run a mini mill, you do care about the cost of electricity. If you run any other kind of heat-intensive industrial process that you've electrified, you very much care about the cost of electricity. So it's a challenge here where you have, I think, a lot of battling and jockeying for position to be in the queue, as a source of demand, but also a pretty wide differential in the way that energy impacts your cost of doing business. And a good reminder, and I'm sure for your listeners, and you'll know this too, is that it's not just data centers. Ford and SK On's Blue Oval factory is in its own right about 300 megawatts of load. Like, that's not insignificant,
No.
Right? And it is, however, one that wherein the cost matters. It's not necessarily a data center being spun up just to do training as quickly as possible. So there's a lot here at play that we also haven't had, not just the growth, but the particular kind of concentration of that growth. And also the differentiation between customer types, I think, is special right now.
Yeah. And now you've been tracking these cycles for years, and you've kind of touched on the generation, storage, mobility, now industrial operations. What do you think is being underhyped right now? There's obviously loads in the press about data centers and things like that. What are you seeing as being super important that people are maybe overlooking based on your extensive research?
The cure for high prices is high prices, right? What I think is underhyped, probably at the general business level, is the relentless experimentation and very real drive for people to become more efficient, to find new ways to do the same with less, or do much more with the same, for new business models to get unlocked, for people to turn what had been a sort of liability or a cost into a resource. I'm speaking very kind of hand wavy and glib here, but I think y'all know what I mean, is that it is these kinds of market conditions that allow new discontinuities to emerge in terms of what people think is possible. In politics, it's an Overton window. What is considered part of the discourse. I think we'll have the same thing equivalent happen in terms of new models for efficiency, new models that happen behind the meter, new ways of contracting for energy, new paradigms for what we use in terms of how people think of what's mission critical, what can be as available, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And the great part is that I don't personally have a good read on any of that, but there are thousands of dedicated entrepreneurs who do, who view this as their present reality and their expectation, and are going to do their very best to make it, and I mean this in a good way, not happen. to make it such that we don't have 200 extra gigawatts of load built in the US because XYZ has happened, because we've done something very different to keep that from happening at a technology, at a business model, at a sort of entrepreneurial level.
Yeah. And then your annual document, what I really enjoyed was the stats you provide are amazing. I think one that stood out for me was 400 local ordinances are against renewables in the US.
Sure.
And then
I'm sure it's more now.
Yeah, exactly. And we're coming off the back of the One Big Beautiful Bill. And there's definitely a lot of negative rhetoric in the market. I think Dan and I feel quite differently. I think we see this as being a real opportunity to drive urgency, drive that innovation, drive that efficiency, and get people to act. Have you got any thoughts or reflections on the Big Beautiful Bill and how it's going to play out across supply chains, and also just motivating and creating urgency for people to get behind some of these ideas that you just shared?
So I'm not as close to it as I would have been in my previous life. Let's put it that way, when I would be able to talk to a whole policy team and look at it. And I say this in this sort of neutral to positive way. I'm quite reactive to it. From an information perspective, I want to see what's there first and get into it as quickly as possible and keep as high frequency as possible a tally on responses. So I think that we're still figuring out the exact set of implications that this is going to have. I will work backwards for the things that I think are the harder lifts, which is kind of making us somehow build more brand new coal-fired power plants. I find unlikely. Can you use various machinations in legislation and regulation to keep older assets online? Possibly. Can you make it more difficult to do renewable development? Yes. Can you also make the financing structures more stringent, tighter, that kind of thing? Yes. But renewable developers, I would say uniquely amongst people in the US, are used to being rug pulled and having to deal with short tenure policy changes. And I think are among the most resilient of the business operators that I've ever met. Not putting a silk hat on a pig here, but it's been interesting to watch the sort of general business community's reaction, let's say in particular in the healthcare sector, to this bill, where people, and I say people at this sort of the lobbyists, the executive level, the organization level, are not used to things randomly changing all of a sudden, and you can very clearly tell that this is a new occurrence. Whereas for renewable developers, it's like, oh yes, I remember this from 2008. I remember this from 2016. I remember this sort of like, bone-jarring set of lurches that might be happening in the policy landscape. But what I will say too is, what's going to move the fastest still? It's still going to be solar and wind. What's the quickest way to probably shore up a grid where there's a reliability issue? It's going to be battery energy storage.
Yeah.
If you're a data center developer, and we're beginning to not necessarily learn, but see more about how they operate as a citizen in the grid. How are you going to manage your intense fluctuation in your demand? That's a simple result of your process. You're probably going to be implementing storage. How are you going to most quickly energize something new? Well, if you have that capability, you might be buying reciprocating engines, but you might also be doing renewables. So I tend to believe that we'll see a lot of supple and innovative response from the sector. I'll leave you with a story on this that your listeners might find interesting. So, in my early BNEF days, I used to have colleagues from Europe come over for what I still think of as SPI, and I guess is now RE+.
Yeah.
Right? So it's usually somewhere in California. We were early days, and what I would tell them is like, come on over. Like, you need to see this landscape, get a sense for why I'm always complaining that the U.S. is not one market; it's actually 50. And a colleague of mine who had covered the Central European markets came over and he said, we have silly market mechanisms too, like overly generous feed-in tariffs that then blow up and whatever. Yours seem to be so much more complicated and so much more sort of legalistic by their nature. And he said, does this market have any sense of how much cost that imparts? Not the benefit, but the cost of having to do all of this. And I said, maybe if you were to get people candid, they might say something about it. And to which he added, he's like, if you wanted to make things really cheap, which is what we keep doing in Eastern Europe, is you give people an incentive and then you rip it away and you'll find out at what cost people can actually do stuff. Right. And so, if we are indeed at the legit sunset of all of these different things, we will have two things. We'll have obviously financial benefits that have been washed away, perhaps permanently. But we will also have a cohort of soft costs that no one has been able to abstract away yet, no longer be there. And I think we'll find some unexpected daylight in that process in terms of what costs there are to arrange, to wrap, to negotiate, that have all been required by the nature of our support mechanisms. These things will be, if they are indeed gone, cost structures will be different.
You hit the nail on the head. I mean, we see that in the C&I space, that there's opportunities to kill the soft costs that can more than make up for any losses to tax credits.
I mean, I live in Singapore. I talk all the time with people in Australia. Australia is not a low labor cost market. And basically every time I talk to them, like, can you please explain to me how things cost so much more in California than they do in Australia? They're like, we have really expensive labor.
Yeah,
really. And I keep telling them the answers, and they seem mystified that the stickiness of planning, permission, paperwork, but also the costs of tax equity arrangement and every other thing go with. And they just say, they're like, listen, if we can make things cheap in Australia or Germany, surely you in California or Texas can figure this out for yourselves.
Yeah. Well, so you touched on somewhere I was going to go is you live in Singapore. You may have a unique lens. I think one of the big parts of the One Big Beautiful Bill is to help protect American energy from foreign entities and specifically the supply chains associated with those. How do you see this shifting the supply chains for solar panels, inverters, battery cells, especially throughout the broader Southeast Asia?
So in theory, I will say that any mechanism to sort of bring this capability into the U.S. would, I think, be very welcome by everyone. In particular, if it can happen at a cost point that is, within some buffer range of where things are right now, which I think should be theoretically possible. The challenge is that there's no durability in the landscape of policy and support to make that happen. And that's the biggest challenge, is that if you were to have like the clean overnight cost of setting up a transformer factory and immediately having things shipped from there into the US, from the US, within the US, I think it would be extremely welcome. Except that people don't know what the shape of the demand curve is going to be in the future, which makes it hard to expand. A. B, Tariffs on every input means that actually the cost of everything you need for that, be it the particular type of grain-oriented steel you need for a transformer, or whatever piece of machine tooling you need, or whatever particular bearing or gear set you need for that machine tooling being tariffed, makes the cost of that operation go up so much that it's very challenging. So the issue, I think, is less around, are people interested in doing things in the US? Because I think legitimately everybody would be. It's a huge market and it's not going away. It's more the durability of the policy framework in which building would happen. If I'm going to build a factory, am I going to be tariffed on my intermediate goods tomorrow? And if I am, how am I going to be able to pass that on? It's why you find even industries that are in theory protected by tariffs, thanks to tariffs on the final goods that they create, are not able to compete right now because the intermediate goods that they need to make those final goods are being tariffed.
Yeah.
So that's the one thing. The other is that the structures in China and increasingly in Southeast Asia to do this kind of production are large. There's a lot of capability. There's very good supply chain and logistics. They're not just big, but they're generally pretty supple and pretty fast moving. And if you're making your on the margin rational decision, it still might make more sense to do that and pay a tariff than it does to sort of do something different and try to buy something that's produced and made in the U.S. And unfortunately, the biggest single driver here is uncertainty, and that has a way of introducing paralysis. When you have near-term uncertainty that then becomes long-term uncertainty, a landscape of uncertainty, how are you supposed to make capital allocation decisions around long-dated assets with a long productive life?
Yeah. And just to follow on from that, before we jump into the power surge questions to round us out, I saw in your deck, ESG had kind of peaked in 2021. I heard the term used in this last week. ESG is now, economics, security, geopolitics. That's what it should stand for. And I think what we're all saying is cost, energy availability, energy security is becoming super critical. What are your reflections on the way the sort of ESG landscape has shifted?
So I think that a lot of these things, again, my Overton window point earlier, are very much a kind of artifact of 2020 and 2021, an era in which interest rates were very low, in which demand was suppressed thanks to COVID. I think it gave a more sort of expansive sense to people of what could fall into the domain of this, to be fair, somewhat poorly defined and not necessarily well correlated set of metrics for measuring companies. The reality has been that we've returned to growth, which obviously impacts the nature of what gets built, right? If everything is growing now, you're no longer eroding a sort of fossil fuel base in the energy sector. You're just building on top of it. Interest rates matter more than anything, and there's no abstracting that away. And also, you're in an uncertain policy landscape where also the governance element of companies might be under sort of less pressure to be clean and green than it used to be. But then, yes, so geopolitics is there, security is there, energy availability. I would add within that, as you said already, Karen, cost is really, really important. And so I feel like, again, the best of the people that we deal with are going to be pretty nimble and supple at matching that particular circumstance, but all in the service of doing what it is that they do best, which is build as quickly as possible, at high quality, as clean as possible, and in as much volume as they can.
We receive a lot of questions from business leaders around the world wanting to learn more about the energy transition, what is possible, and where to start. So to help you stay informed and up to date on best practices, opportunities, risks, and success stories, we created an industry newsfeed at VECKTA.com/news with all our podcasts, blogs, and newsletter. Check it out and connect with Dan, myself, and the VECKTA team to learn more. Cheers and have a good one.